They laughed at the tanks, until they heard voices inside the noise. February 1943, the desert north of Kasserine Pass shimmered beneath a sun that turned steel into mirrors and men into shadows. Across the dunes, Major Otto Reinhardt of the Afrika Korps raised his binoculars and smirked. Through the waves of heat, he saw them, American Shermans crawling forward, their olive-drab paint already coated with dust, their movements clumsy and uneven. "Tin cans," he said to his crew. "Detroit toys. They'll burn before noon." Around him, German tankers chuckled, the confident laughter of veterans who had crushed everything placed before them since Poland. Then the first shells began to fall, and the laughter stopped echoing, but not because of what they saw. It was because of what they heard. Through the desert, wind came something uncanny, a rhythm of motion, not chaotic like most new armies, but synchronized, deliberate, almost alive. Reinhardt watched through the scope as 5 Shermans, scattered across the ridges with no line of sight between them, advanced like parts of a single organism. One moved to high ground, while another pivoted to cover. When one halted, another fired. The coordination was too perfect. No flares, no flags, no runners darting between vehicles. Nothing. Only dust and motion, as though the tanks shared one mind. Inside the lead Sherman, Captain Jack Miller gripped the turret handle, sweat carving lines through the sand on his face. "Red 2, this is Red 1. His voice came calm through the headset. "Target 2 o'clock, range 600, fire on my mark." The reply came instantly, clean, not distorted by the engine's roar. "Copy that, Red 1, firing." The shot landed within seconds, forcing a Panzer IV to veer off course. Miller switched frequencies seamlessly. "Red 3, cover that ridge. Red 5, move to flank." To the Germans watching from their command post, the scene defied logic. Their own radios crackled with static and half-sentences. Reinhardt barked into his handset. "Panzergruppe 2, forward, forward!" But the reply came garbled, broken, and then vanished. His operator pounded the transmitter, shaking his head. "Interference again, Herr Major. We can hear, but we cannot be heard." Reinhardt turned back to the horizon. The American tanks had shifted formation again, fluid and confident. He could not understand how they knew what each other was doing, how they reacted faster than he could think. "How can they move as one without signals?" he muttered, disbelief hardening into unease. Through the binoculars, he saw one Sherman pause, its turret rotating toward him like an eye finding its mark. A blast followed, and the ground around his command post erupted in sand and dust. As the smoke cleared, Reinhardt lowered his binoculars, his face pale beneath the grime. For the first time in the Desert War, he felt something he had not expected: confusion. Around him, his men worked frantically, shouting into dead radios, waving flags no one could see through the dust. In that chaos, the Americans advanced again, methodical and precise, each tank covering the other's blind spot. Their voices carried not by sight or luck, but by something invisible in the air. To Reinhardt, it seemed supernatural, almost unreal, as if the enemy had found a way to share a single heartbeat across the battlefield. He stared into the haze where the Shermans vanished behind a ridge, the desert swallowing their sound, but not their presence. "Perhaps," he whispered to himself, "they are not as foolish as we thought." What he could not know was that the true weapon of those Shermans was not their gun or armor, but a signal born thousands of miles away, in a quiet Detroit workshop where engineers once dreamed of making machines talk. 2 years before the Battle of Kasserine, in the winter of 1941, the snow fell softly outside a red brick factory on the edge of Chicago. Inside, men and women worked in silence, broken only by the hum of soldering irons and the click of metal tools. Among them was a young engineer named Frank Doyle. He had come from Detroit, where his father had built car radios, and now he found himself building something far stranger, a communication system for tanks that would have to speak clearly through fire and thunder. The man guiding him, Daniel Noble, was older, calm, with the steady hand of someone who saw beyond the noise of the present. "Frank," he said, his voice barely rising above the machines. "The difference between chaos and command is just a few decibels of clarity." Noble believed that if soldiers could talk in the middle of battle, they could think together. And so, day after day, Doyle adjusted circuits, replaced burned resistors, and tested crystals that shattered under heat. The radio they were building was called the SCR-508, a machine heavier than a man, but precise to the point of poetry. It could transmit across miles of desert without the static that crippled the old German systems. To the untrained eye, it was just wires and metal. But to Doyle, it was a heartbeat, a way for one human voice to reach another through the noise of war. Late one night, when everyone else had gone, Doyle switched on the prototype. He whispered into the microphone, "Testing, 1, 2, 3. And in another room, a speaker answered with his own voice, sharp and clean. No static, no distortion. He smiled, not because of pride, but because for the first time, a machine had carried human clarity through chaos. Motorola's engineers worked like this through the turning of seasons, their nights measured by the rhythm of signal tests. Noble kept reminding them why it mattered. "The Germans believe discipline keeps an army together," he told them. "We'll show that communication does." Outside, the world was already on fire. German armies were tearing through Europe and the Soviet plains, their panzer divisions operating with radio systems built on amplitude modulation, a technology from another decade. AM could carry power, but not precision. The more the tanks moved, the more interference consumed their messages. Every spark plug became an enemy. Meanwhile, in the American Midwest, engineers who had once built car radios and jukebox amplifiers were now crafting the invisible weapon that would change modern warfare. The SCR-508 used frequency modulation, FM, an innovation that filtered out the noise. It produced a signal so stable that even when tanks roared at full throttle, the commander could whisper and be heard as if standing beside his crew. The first field tests came at Fort Knox. Rows of new Sherman tanks rolled over mud, while Doyle, now in uniform, monitored the transmissions. Officers watching from the ridge saw something unprecedented. Each tank moved in harmony, no confusion, no lag between orders. When one commander gave an instruction, 10 others responded within seconds. The colonel in charge removed his cap and said quietly, "Gentlemen, you just built an army that can talk to itself." It wasn't bravado, it was the birth of a network. And that network would soon travel overseas, carried inside every Sherman that left the assembly lines of Detroit. By the summer of 1942, America's factories had become the lungs of a sleeping giant. Each SCR-508 radio required more than 2,000 parts, crystals, resistors, capacitors, all assembled by hand. Women in blue overalls soldered connections beneath bright lamps, while engineers tested the finished sets in vibration chambers that mimicked battlefield shocks. Doyle supervised final checks, marking every radio that passed his standard with a small white D. It became a quiet signature that would ride into battle, from Tunisia to Normandy. He knew that somewhere, some crew he would never meet might owe their lives to the clarity of a signal that began in his hands. In December 1942, as the first shipments left for North Africa, Noble visited Doyle on the production floor. "Remember," he said, "we're not just building radios. We're building trust between men who may never see each other." Doyle nodded, but he wondered if the soldiers would understand what that meant. A month later, he received a telegram, his transfer orders. The Army wanted him in the field, attached to the 1st Armored Division as a communications officer. He packed his tools, his notebooks, and one of the first SCR-508 units to leave the line. When he reached Tunisia, he saw the desert for the first time and felt the air vibrating with heat. This, he thought, is where the signal will have to survive. The Germans had the experience, the tactics, the heavier guns. The Americans had the voice, and that voice would soon echo across dunes where no one thought words could travel. Doyle spent his first nights adjusting the frequencies, fine-tuning crystals that had drifted during shipment, teaching tank crews how to use the system. At first they laughed. It seemed too simple, too fragile for war. But on a quiet dawn before Kasserine, as engines idled and the horizon turned red, Captain Jack Miller leaned from his turret and called out, "Doyle, can you hear me?" The reply came crisp. "Loud and clear, sir." Miller grinned. "Then let's see if Detroit can talk its way through a German storm." And when that storm came, when the desert erupted with shells and smoke, the voice of one young engineer carried through the chaos, binding 5 tanks into one mind. Back in his command post, Otto, Reinhardt would soon learn that the real battle was no longer fought with steel, but with sound. For as the desert filled with thunder, another question began to haunt him. What invisible hand was guiding those tanks through the fire? The morning sun of Kasserine burned white over a landscape of shattered rock and drifting sand. From the ridge, Captain Jack Miller could barely see his own lead tank through the haze. Visibility was measured in yards, not miles, and yet every voice in his headset came through as if the men were shoulder to shoulder. "Red 2, move left. Red 3, hold your fire. Red 5, keep your turret east." Miller's tone was calm, the sound of someone who knew chaos but refused to be consumed by it. Inside his turret, the heat was suffocating, the air thick with the stench of fuel and sweat. But the sound in his ears, Doyle's clear voice, relaying reports from other crews, cut through the confusion like a lifeline. "Enemy armor approaching the ridge bearing 180, Doyle said. Miller acknowledged, adjusting his periscope. Through the shimmering air, he glimpsed the outline of a Panzer cresting the hill. "Copy that. Red 2, mark it." The shot landed true, and the German tank vanished in a cloud of sand and smoke. For Miller's men, the radio wasn't just a tool, it was a sense. It allowed them to see what their eyes could not, to fight as if guided by instinct. In another tank a mile away, Sergeant Boyd muttered a quick prayer of thanks before calling in coordinates for artillery support. Within seconds, shells screamed overhead. It felt less like battle and more like choreography, an orchestra conducted through the airwaves. But to Major Otto Reinhardt, it was a nightmare made real. His formation, once the pride of the Afrika Korps, had dissolved into fragments. Orders went unanswered. Replies arrived too late, or not at all. "Panzergruppe 2, forward!" he shouted again into his handset. The only response was static, a cruel hiss that mocked him. His operator adjusted dials frantically, shaking his head. "Interference, Herr Major. We can hear them, but they cannot hear us." Reinhardt slammed his fist on the radio and looked toward the horizon where the Shermans moved in eerie coordination. It defied everything he had learned about war. In his mind, he replayed the last decade, how the Wehrmacht had conquered Europe with speed and communication, how German officers once prided themselves on discipline and precision. And now here, in the dust of Africa, he faced an enemy that fought faster, spoke clearer, and thought together. He watched as one Sherman backed into cover while another replaced its position without hesitation, their turrets pivoting in unison. "How can they move as one without signals?" he whispered. But the answer was already swirling in the air around him, carried on frequencies his machines could not understand. On the American side, Doyle sat hunched inside a cramped half-track, headphones pressed tight against his ears. Static flared and vanished as he adjusted the tuning knobs. "Captain, comms are stable. Range is holding at full power," he said into the mic. Miller's voice came back, sharp and steady. "Good work, Lieutenant. Keep the line clear. We've got company." Doyle smiled faintly. He could hear the German transmissions breaking apart in the background. Fragmented words, desperate calls for support that never reached their targets. The contrast was almost cruel. When the sun reached its zenith, the battlefield shimmered like a mirage. Dust storms blurred friend and foe, and still the Shermans advanced. At one point, a German shell struck close enough to rock Miller's tank onto its tracks. For a moment, silence filled the radio. Then Doyle's voice returned, soft but resolute. "You still with us, Red One?" "Still here," Miller replied, his knuckles white on the controls. "Let's finish this." The next salvo came coordinated from 3 directions, the kind of precision that required not just courage, but communication. In less than an hour, what began as an ambush had turned into an orderly American counterattack. When it was over, the desert fell silent except for the crackle of damaged radios. Doyle stepped out of his vehicle, the horizon blurring with heat. Around him, the wrecks of Panzer IVs smoked quietly. Their crews vanished into the dunes. He didn't feel triumph, only awe at how invisible waves of sound could change the fate of men. Miles away, Reinhardt stood beside his disabled command tank, staring at the broken antenna drooping like a withered branch. The desert wind carried faint echoes of American chatter, unfamiliar words, but steady, confident, alive. He realized then that the enemy wasn't winning through armor or numbers, but through connection. For every order he shouted into silence, his opponents whispered through the storm and were heard. He turned to his adjutant, a young lieutenant with sand caked on his face. "They have found a way to make their tanks think," Reinhardt said quietly. The lieutenant hesitated. "Machines cannot think, sir." Reinhardt looked back toward the drifting smoke where the Shermans had disappeared. "Perhaps not," he said, "but their men can. Together." As dusk settled, Doyle repaired the radio that had overheated during the fight. The equipment hummed, the signal steady once more. He noted the readings in his logbook and paused, hearing the faint pulse of transmission across the channel, a heartbeat made of electricity. The technology had done its job, but deep down he sensed something greater had happened. Men separated by dunes and death had managed to remain a single voice. And across the battlefield, Major Reinhardt, still clutching his useless handset, felt the same truth from the other side of silence. For the first time, the Germans began to fear not what they could see, but what they couldn't hear. And soon, that fear would spread beyond the desert, into every sky and shore the American voice could reach. When the battles of North Africa ended, the world believed the tanks had fought to a draw. But under the sand, something invisible had already shifted, the balance of communication. For the Germans, victory had always meant speed and precision, the lightning coordination that once defined blitzkrieg. Yet by 1943, their advantage had turned brittle. The air between their machines was filled with static, while the Americans carried clarity through every mile of dust. In the laboratories of Motorola back home, engineers tracked the war through the same frequencies they had built, their test sets humming late into the night as reports from the front arrived. Frank Doyle's early field notes were studied line by line, confirming that the new FM system worked even through the noise of tank engines and artillery. What no one fully realized yet was that this silent contest of radio waves would determine not only battles, but the very structure of modern warfare. In Stuttgart, German technicians tried to understand what had gone wrong. Their Fugue 5 radios, designed a decade earlier, operated on amplitude modulation, AM, a method powerful in theory, but fragile in reality. Each panzer carried only one transmitter per platoon. The others could receive but not speak. The result was a hierarchy of silence. A commander might shout into his microphone, but half his men could only listen, unable to warn him of danger or report when their guns were gone. The air was full of orders, but none of them came back. Meanwhile, on the American side, Every Sherman tank became both voice and ear. The SCR-508, with its 25 watts of power and crystal-controlled frequency, could speak clearly over 7 to 10 miles, even when moving. Its frequency modulation canceled the electrical noise from engines, sparks, and explosions. Soldiers compared it to hearing through the storm, a sound so sharp it seemed unnatural. "I can hear your heartbeat through the static," one tank gunner wrote in his diary. He wasn't wrong. The system made men feel less alone. In Italy, where mountains should have killed radio range, the FM sets outperformed expectations. Valleys that swallowed German signals carried American voices as if the hills themselves were transmitters. Doyle, still attached to the 1st Armored Division, marveled at how the air seemed to favor them. "It's not magic," he said during a briefing. "It's science that listens better." Across the line, Otto Reinhardt watched in frustration as his division's coordination collapsed again and again. The terrain turned his radios into useless metal. He ordered messengers to ride on motorcycles between units, but the mountains devoured time. He wrote to headquarters that the enemy's radio discipline is remarkable, unaware that discipline was only half the story. It was the technology beneath the discipline, the FM signal itself, that made such order possible. Back in America, production of the SCR-508 climbed past 20,000 units. Women on the assembly line soldered components with hands steady as surgeons, while inspectors tested each radio in simulated combat vibration. Motorola's engineers, driven by a quiet sense of duty, solved problem after problem. Heat tolerance, voltage variation, even the shock of gunfire. Every improvement meant one less voice lost to static. It was an invisible miracle that spread faster than tanks themselves. But for all its promise, the system revealed one flaw. In Normandy, where American forces landed the following year, tank radios couldn't yet speak to infantry sets. The Shermans operated between 20 and 28 megahertz, while the soldiers' backpack units worked on higher frequencies. The result was fatal confusion in the hedgerows, tanks advancing without warning, infantry unable to call for cover. Doyle, now serving as senior communications officer, proposed a desperate fix, welding field telephones to the rear of tanks so infantry could speak directly to the crew. Simple, crude, and effective. The first tests turned chaos into order again. The problem of connection, it seemed, could always be solved by listening harder. Reinhardt, by contrast, was learning the limits of what he once called German precision. Every spark from a Panzer engine jammed its own signal. His men spent hours adjusting dials that would never align. The Fug 5's variable tuning drifted with every jolt, every vibration. It was like trying to speak while someone kept moving the mouthpiece. He noted bitterly in his field log, "They are not stronger, only more connected." And yet, in that admission lay a deeper truth. Connection was strength. By late 1943, the contrast was visible across the front. American units could form task forces on the fly, merging tanks, artillery, and infantry under a single command net. Orders flowed down and reports came up within minutes. The Germans, bound by their own radio poverty, fought in fragments, blind to each other's movements. The irony was painful. Years earlier, their own theorists had written that communication was the soul of armored warfare. Now that soul belonged to someone else. On a rainy evening near Naples, Doyle adjusted his headset and listened to the chatter of dozens of units moving through the valleys. To him, it sounded almost musical, a conversation of machines and men breathing in rhythm. "We're building an orchestra," he told a fellow officer. "The only thing they can hear on the other side is static." In the ruins of a captured Panzer, he examined the German radio and shook his head. It was rugged, simple, and already obsolete. He thought of Noble back in Chicago, still testing the next generation of transmitters, and wondered if this was how revolutions began, not with fire, but with frequency. By the end of that year, it was clear. Whoever controlled the air between men controlled the field beneath them. Doyle realized the lesson that would echo for decades, that in war, silence kills faster than bullets. And as the winter of 1943 turned to the spring of 1944, he received orders for another transfer, this time to England, where the greatest invasion in history was being planned. The Shermans would soon roll through the hedgerows of Normandy, their radios tuned and waiting, and when they landed, the laughter that had once filled the desert would die forever beneath the sound of a single, united voice. June 1944. The beaches of Normandy burned beneath gray clouds and the endless rumble of engines. For the first time, the full symphony of American radio filled the air. Thousands of transmitters humming in unison from landing craft, jeeps and tanks waiting offshore. Lieutenant Frank Doyle stood aboard a transport ship, headphones clamped tight, his clipboard trembling with each detonation. Through the static, he could hear fragments of messages from the beach, code words, coordinates, desperate calls for clearance, and among them, a steady pulse that reminded him of home. It was the heartbeat of a machine network stretching from the sand to the sky. When Captain Jack Miller's Sherman rolled off the ramp and hit French soil, he did not look up. His world was inside his headset. Red 2, to my right. Red 4, watch the tree line. His voice was calm, steady, the same tone he had carried across the desert. But here, the fight was different, closer, denser, invisible behind hedgerows thick as walls. German artillery roared from beyond the fields, and every road seemed to end in smoke. The difference was that this time, Miller's unit could speak to everyone. The infantry behind, the artillery batteries miles away, even the ships offshore. Doyle had spent months ensuring that the networks overlapped, that no man would fight alone again. He sat in a tent near the coast, surrounded by maps and wires, listening as hundreds of voices crossed and blended. It was chaos, yet somehow organized, like a city at rush hour that still moved. Across the line, Major Otto Reinhardt watched from a farmhouse window. His Panzer Division, now stationed in France, was a shadow of its former power. His men were brave, but blind. Their radios sputtered with interference from the Allied transmissions that blanketed the air. "We cannot coordinate," his signal officer said. "It's as if the air itself belongs to them." Reinhardt gritted his teeth. Through his binoculars, he saw columns of Shermans weaving through narrow roads, shifting positions with uncanny precision. They fired and withdrew before his gunners could align. It wasn't luck. It was design. When one tank fired, others repositioned automatically, each guided by the same invisible voice. He ordered a counterattack, but without radio contact. His units moved too late. The Americans were already gone. Operation Cobra began weeks later. The fields of Normandy turned into thunder. 200 Sherman tanks rolled together under an overcast sky, their engines merging into a low hum like a living creature. Doyle coordinated the main frequency from a forward post, switching between networks as easily as changing thoughts. "All units, advance on my mark," came Miller's voice, crisp as if he were standing in the next room. Then the fields erupted. The Shermans moved, in perfect rhythm, an armored wave that bent but never broke. When artillery fire rained down, they adapted instantly, each commander shifting formation without needing to see the others. For German observers, it looked impossible. Reinhardt's men, trapped by miscommunication, shouted to one another across the smoke, unaware that their voices never carried. "They react faster than we can think," Reinhardt muttered, and for the first time, he felt the old pride of blitzkrieg turned against him. Doyle's network had become more than a system. It was a mind, with every tank as a neuron firing in time. The sound of it was eerie, mechanical yet human. a constant murmur of codes, acknowledgements, laughter even, rising between bursts of static. One war correspondent wrote later that the battlefield sounded like a choir speaking in metal tones. And yet, beneath that order was exhaustion. Miller's men had been fighting without rest, their hands blistered, their voices hoarse. When one of his tanks took a direct hit, he ordered the others not to stop. "We keep moving," he said quietly. "That's what they built us for." The radio carried his words farther than he knew. Somewhere miles away, another crew picked up the message and whispered it back, as if repeating a prayer. By the third day of Cobra, the German lines were collapsing. Their command nets had failed completely. Reinhardt tried to raise his superiors, but heard nothing but the hiss of defeat. He realized then that his tanks, for all their armor and firepower, were deaf. Each fought alone, unaware of the others, like islands sinking one by one. As dusk fell, Miller's formation reached the outskirts of a ruined village. Smoke clung to the roofs like fog. Through the static, Doyle's voice came softly. "Jack, you're clear to move. The road ahead is open." Miller leaned back, exhaustion washing over him. "Copy that," he said. And for a moment, he closed his eyes to the hum of the radio, the one sound that had followed him from Africa to Europe, from dust to rain. Far behind, Reinhardt stood beside his immobilized Panzer, his face lit by the glow of burning fuel. He could hear faint American chatter drifting through the night, words he didn't understand, but recognized as unity. He lowered his pistol, staring into the distance. "It's not their tanks," he said quietly to no one. "It's their voices." The war had entered a new dimension, one where steel mattered less than signal, where victory came not from the loudest explosion, but from the clearest word. As dawn approached, the surviving German officers regrouped, but their orders arrived too late. The Allied armor was already miles ahead, moving as if guided by one will. Doyle removed his headset and rubbed his temples, hearing the silence of triumph and the weight of what it meant. The air was no longer just air. It was a battlefield of frequencies. And for the first time in history, it belonged entirely to those who could speak through it. But for one German officer, realization came too late. On the banks of the Rhine, where the echoes of that invisible war would end in silence. The winter of 1945 hung over Germany like a closing curtain. The once proud divisions of the Wehrmacht were splintered and scattered, their communications shattered by air raids and retreat. Bridges collapsed, roads dissolved into mud, and command posts lay buried beneath rubble. Among the retreating officers was Major Otto Reinhardt, his Panzer regiment reduced to a handful of exhausted men and a single working radio that no longer transmitted. They followed the Rhine upstream, clinging to orders that no longer reached them. At night, Reinhardt would turn the dials, listening for familiar voices in the static. All he heard was emptiness, a whisper of defeat carried by broken frequencies. To him, the silence of his own machines was louder than the thunder of Allied guns. Each hiss and crack reminded him of the enemy who had conquered the air, not with bombs, but with the clarity of connection. Across the river, the Americans moved as a single organism once again. Captain Jack Miller's Sherman Company advanced cautiously toward the Ludendorff Bridge at Remagen, where rumor said a crossing still stood. Lieutenant Frank Doyle sat beside him in the command tank, headphones pressed tight, listening to overlapping transmissions from armor, infantry, and aircraft above. The network was alive, a web of voices guiding every movement. "Red 1 to Eagle 6, bridge confirmed intact," Miller reported. The reply came seconds later, crisp and calm. "Roger that. Hold until engineers arrive." The order moved down the line instantly, dozens of tanks halting in perfect unison, their engines idling like one great machine. Doyle exhaled in quiet disbelief. 3 years ago, he had tested the first prototype of this radio in a dimly lit Chicago lab. Now it was orchestrating an army across a continent. The bridge at Remagen would become a symbol not only of momentum, but of communication itself. A link that refused to break. When Miller's tank rolled onto its wooden planks, the Rhine glistened below like liquid steel. The air buzzed with overlapping signals, a harmony of coordination that no amount of German artillery could silence. Behind him, Reinhardt's scattered units tried desperately to respond, but their transmissions failed again and again. The Fugue 5 sets that once led Blitzkrieg now coughed static and died under the strain of interference. His men looked to him for guidance, but all he could do was point toward the sound of engines on the far bank and say, "They're already there!" He watched as American armor poured across the river in formation so smooth it seemed rehearsed.
Think they'll ever understand what really won this
"They move like one body," a young soldier whispered. Reinhardt nodded slowly, his eyes dim with understanding. "No," he said, "like one mind." When the battle ended and the bridge stood secured, Miller climbed down from his tank and stretched his legs beside the water. Doyle joined him, holding the headset that had carried every word of the operation. For a long moment they said nothing, listening instead to the murmur of distant transmissions, the heartbeat of victory pulsing through the air. Doyle finally spoke. "You think they'll ever understand what really won this war?" Miller smiled faintly. "Maybe someday, when they stop looking at the tanks and start listening to the silence between them." Months later, when peace finally came, Doyle returned to Detroit. The war factories were quieter now. The assembly lines turned toward the future. Inside the same workshop where he once soldered circuits by hand, new engineers were designing radios for homes, cars, and schools. The technology that had carried orders through fire would now carry music and news through living rooms. Doyle supervised the first test broadcast of a civilian FM network, hearing the clear tone of jazz fill the room. It was the same clarity that once saved men's lives, now repurposed to rebuild them. He closed his eyes and let the melody wash over him, realizing that the signal had never really belonged to war. It had always belonged to people. Across the ocean, in a ruined town near Frankfurt, Reinhardt sat in what was left of his headquarters, his uniform threadbare, his hands stained with oil. He had salvaged a captured American radio from an abandoned Sherman, its metal casing still marked with the faint letters SCR 508. When he powered it on, the sound startled him. Not commands, not static, but music, drifting softly through the wreckage. For the first time since the war began, he heard something beautiful carried by the same frequencies that once destroyed his world. He set the receiver down and smiled, a small, weary smile of understanding. "So this," he murmured, "is what they were really fighting for." In the years that followed, nations rebuilt their armies and their industries, but none forgot the lesson of that invisible weapon. The next generation of German engineers, many once soldiers, studied the same FM principles and applied them to new designs, ensuring that their machines would never again be deaf. From those ashes rose a new philosophy of warfare and peace alike. That connection meant survival, and silence meant extinction. As the 1950s dawned, the hum of radios filled homes from New York to Munich, bridging the world that war had torn apart. For those who remembered, that sound carried more than music. It carried memory. In the late spring of 1945, when the guns had fallen quiet and the air finally stopped trembling, Doyle returned once more to his field log. On its final page, he wrote only a single sentence. The Sherman's greatest weapon was not its firepower, but its voice. Decades later, that truth would still echo through every communication network, every cockpit, every command post built since the age of the platoons Talking army had begun in the dust of North Africa, in a world that discovered that words could move faster than bullets. And long after the smoke cleared, one truth endured above all others, that the power to connect was the power to survive, and that even in victory, the strongest sound of all was the silence that followed the signal.